The quiet transfer student's hidden power. 3 football players thought they could humiliate the new girl on her first day. They had no idea she was a second-degree black belt in karate. Emma Rodriguez pressed her palms against the cool metal of her new locker, taking a deep breath as the unfamiliar sounds of Riverside High School echoed around her. The mountain air in Millbrook, Colorado, felt different in her lungs compared to the perpetual drizzle of Portland, Oregon. Everything here seemed sharper, cleaner, and infinitely more intimidating. At 16, Emma had the kind of understated athleticism that came from years of disciplined training, though her lean frame was hidden beneath a simple gray hoodie and dark jeans. Her long black hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and her dark eyes held a quiet intensity that most people mistook for shyness. October in the Rocky Mountains painted everything in brilliant oranges and golds, but Emma barely noticed the beauty outside the windows as she navigated the maze of hallways in her new school. Starting mid-semester was brutal enough without having to decode an entirely new social ecosystem. Back in Portland, she had been just another face in a diverse crowd of 2,000 students. Here at Riverside High, with its 800 students and tight-knit community dynamics, being the outsider felt like wearing a neon sign. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first period bell had already rung when Emma finally located her English classroom, slipping through the door just as Mrs. Anderson was calling attendance. 28 pairs of eyes turned to assess the newcomer, and Emma felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Mrs. Anderson, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying brown hair, smiled warmly and gestured to an empty desk near the window. "Class, we have a new student joining us today. Emma Rodriguez has transferred here from Portland, Oregon." Mrs. Anderson's voice carried genuine warmth, but Emma could feel the weight of curious stares boring into her back as she took her seat. "Emma, would you like to tell us a little about yourself?" Standing awkwardly beside her desk, Emma tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm Emma. My mom and I moved here because she got a job at Millbrook General Hospital. She's a nurse." Her voice was steady but quiet, and she could hear whispers starting up around the classroom. "City girl. Probably thinks she's better than us." The usual assumptions that followed her wherever she went. What none of them knew, what Emma had never advertised anywhere she lived, was that beneath her unassuming exterior lay 8 years of intensive karate training. From age 8 to 16, she had spent every Tuesday and Thursday evening and Saturday morning at Sensei Williams' dojo in Southeast Portland. What had started as her mother's desperate attempt to help a shy, bullied elementary school student defend herself had evolved into something much deeper. Emma had earned her first-degree black belt at 14, and just 6 months before the move, she had successfully tested for her second degree. Sensei Williams had been more than an instructor. He had been a mentor who taught that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the discipline to protect what mattered. "Karate is a last resort, Emma-san," he would say in his calm, measured voice during their final lesson together. "Your greatest victory will always be the fight you don't have to fight." The old dojo smelled of sweat and determination, filled with the sounds of controlled breathing and the sharp crack of breaking boards. Emma missed it terribly. The morning crawled by with the usual first-day routine of introductions to teachers who seemed uncertain how to place her, and classmates who observed her with the cautious interest typically reserved for exotic animals. During second period biology, she found herself partnered with Sophie Chen, a petite Asian girl with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed as comfortable with being invisible as Emma usually was. "You'll like Mrs. Anderson," Sophie said quietly as they worked through a lab assignment together. "She actually cares about whether we understand the material. Most of the teachers here are okay, But some of them have been here so long they're basically sleepwalking through their lessons. Sophie had moved to Millbrook 2 years earlier when her father took a job with the Forest Service, and she understood the peculiar challenges of being an outsider in a place where some families had lived for generations. "What about the social situation?" Emma asked, carefully adjusting their microscope focus. "I mean, who should I avoid?" Sophie glanced around the lab, making sure they weren't overheard. "Jake Thompson and his crew basically run the school. Jake's the football captain, thinks he's God's gift to the universe. His dad owns the biggest construction company in town, so the family has money and influence. Connor Walsh and Ryan Mitchell are his constant shadows. Connor plays soccer and thinks he's funny, but mostly he's just mean. Ryan's on the basketball team and he's not as bad as the other two, but he goes along with whatever they decide." Emma nodded, filing away the information. Every school had its hierarchy, and every hierarchy had its enforcers. She had learned to navigate these social minefields in Portland, staying under the radar and avoiding confrontation whenever possible. The strategy had worked well enough, allowing her to focus on her studies and her training without unnecessary drama. Third period brought her first real glimpse of the school's social dynamics in action. Walking through the main hallway toward her geometry class, Emma witnessed Jake Thompson in full display mode. He stood near a bank of lockers surrounded by his usual audience, his Letterman jacket pristine and his blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 6'2", with the broad shoulders that came from years of football training, Jake commanded attention simply by existing in a space. "Did you guys see Martinez's face when coach made him run extra laps yesterday?" Jake was saying, his voice carrying easily over the hallway noise. "I thought he was going to cry right there, on the field. Maybe if he spent less time with his little girlfriend and more time in the weight room, he wouldn't be such a disappointment." Connor Walsh, a wiry redhead with a perpetual smirk, laughed a little too loudly at Jake's comment. "Speaking of disappointments, did you see the new girl? Looks like she shops at thrift stores. Probably can't afford real clothes coming from whatever trailer park she escaped from." Emma's jaw tightened as she realized they were talking about her, but she kept walking, her sneakers silent on the polished linoleum floor. She had dealt with bullies before, had learned through painful experience in elementary school that reacting only gave them more ammunition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Better to blend into the background and avoid their attention altogether. Ryan Mitchell, the tallest of the three at an even 6 feet, had darker hair and a slightly more thoughtful expression than his companions. "Maybe we should give her a chance," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "She hasn't done anything to us." "Hasn't done anything yet," Jake corrected, his blue eyes scanning the hallway with the predatory focus of someone accustomed to being the apex predator in his environment. "But mark my words, these outsiders always think they're better than us locals. She'll start talking about how much cooler Portland is, how backward we all are here in the mountains. They always do." Emma made it to geometry class without further incident, but she could feel the weight of being watched, assessed, and already judged. Her teacher, Mr. Peterson, was an elderly man who seemed more interested in his coffee than in learning his students' names, which suited Emma fine. She preferred anonymity to unwanted attention. Lunch period arrived with all the chaos typical of high school cafeterias everywhere. Riverside High's cafeteria was a study in social geography, with clearly defined territories marked by invisible but rigid boundaries. The football players commanded the center tables, their letter jackets and easy confidence marking them as the undisputed royalty of the school ecosystem. Cheerleaders clustered at nearby tables, their perfectly coordinated outfits and animated conversations creating a barrier between the elite and everyone else. Emma grabbed a turkey sandwich and a bottle of water, scanning the room for somewhere to sit that wouldn't attract attention. She spotted Sophie Chen at a table near the windows, sitting alone with a book propped open beside her lunch tray. Sophie looked up as Emma approached, offering a small smile of welcome. "Mind if I sit here?" Emma asked, though she was already settling into the empty chair across from Sophie. "Please do. I was starting to feel like a crazy person eating lunch with only my chemistry textbook for company." Sophie closed her book and pushed it aside. "How's your first day going so far?" "About what I expected," Emma replied, unwrapping her sandwich. "New school, new faces, same basic dynamics as everywhere else. The popular kids rule the center of the room. Everyone else fills in around the edges according to their place in the hierarchy." Sophie nodded, glancing over at the football table where Jake Thompson was holding court. "Pretty much. Jake and his friends have been the kings of this place since freshman year. Most people either worship them or stay out of their way. I've found that keeping a low profile works best." Emma was about to respond when a commotion erupted from the direction of the football table. Jake had stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and was pointing toward a table of younger students near the lunch line. "Hey, freshman!" His voice boomed across the cafeteria. "Yeah, you with the glasses. Did you just take a picture of me?" A scrawny boy, who couldn't have been more than 14, was frantically shaking his head, his face red with embarrassment as every eye in the cafeteria turned toward him. No, I was just texting my mom," he stammered, holding up his phone with shaking hands. "Let me see that phone," Jake demanded, striding over to the freshman's table with Connor and Ryan flanking him. The cafeteria had gone completely silent, the usual chatter replaced by the electric tension that preceded either entertainment or disaster, depending on your perspective. Emma watched the scene unfold with growing unease. The freshman boy looked terrified as Jake snatched his phone away, scrolling through it with theatrical suspicion. "What's this? A text to mommy saying the football players are being mean to you." Jake's voice dripped with mock concern. "Maybe you should tell mommy to pack you a different lunch. This cafeteria food might be too advanced for little boys who can't handle high school." Connor laughed and grabbed the boy's lunch tray, lifting it above his head. "Oops," he said with exaggerated clumsiness, then let the tray slip from his fingers. It clattered to the floor, sending the freshman's lunch scattering across the linoleum in a mess of spilled milk and scattered food. Emma's hands clenched into fists under the table. She could feel the familiar surge of righteous anger that her sensei had taught her to recognize and control. This was exactly the kind of situation Sensei Williams had prepared her for, but it was also exactly the kind of situation her mother had begged her to avoid. "Please, mija," Maria Rodriguez had said during their last heart-to-heart conversation. Before the move, "I know you can take care of yourself, but sometimes the best way to take care of yourself is to not get involved. We need this fresh start." The freshman boy was on his hands and knees, trying to clean up his ruined lunch while fighting back tears. Other students watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the target. A few teachers were visible at the edges of the cafeteria, but they seemed to be looking anywhere except at the unfolding drama. "Next time, maybe think twice before you point that camera at people who are out of your league," Jake said, tossing the boy's phone back to him with deliberate carelessness. It bounced once on the table before clattering to the floor, the screen cracking on impact. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, taking the deep, centering breath that Sensei Williams had drilled into her during thousands of hours of training. When she opened them, Sophie was looking at her with concern. "You okay?" Sophie whispered. "You look like you're about to explode." "I'm fine," Emma replied, though her voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Just not used to seeing that kind of thing happen without consequences." "Welcome to Riverside High," Sophie said sadly. "Jake's dad donates enough money to the athletic program that the administration basically lets him do whatever he wants, as long as he doesn't actually put anyone in the hospital." The rest of lunch passed without further incident, but Emma found herself unable to concentrate on her afternoon classes. The image of the terrified freshman boy cleaning up his scattered lunch kept replaying in her mind, along with the sound of his phone screen cracking against the cafeteria floor. This was why she had started learning karate in the first place, to stand up to bullies who picked on people who couldn't defend themselves. But this wasn't Portland, where she could afford to make enemies and still blend into a crowd of thousands. This was Millbrook, population 15,000, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and her mother's new job depended on them building a reputation as reliable, drama-free residents. Emma had promised her mother she would keep her head down, focus on her studies, and avoid the kind of trouble that had occasionally found her in Portland when her sense of justice overrode her sense of self-preservation. The final bell rang. At 3:15, and Emma gathered her things slowly, hoping to avoid the crush of students rushing toward the exits. She had survived her first day at Riverside High without major incident, which felt like a minor victory. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, but at least the unknown quantity of her new environment was becoming slightly more familiar. She was walking toward the student parking lot, where her mother would pick her up, when she heard the voices coming from around the corner of the gymnasium building. Emma recognized Jake Thompson's distinctive laugh immediately, followed by Connor Walsh's higher-pitched snicker. Something in their tone made her pause, pressing herself against the brick wall and listening carefully. "Did you see the way she was looking at us during lunch?" Jake was saying. "Like she thought she was better than us or something. Classic city girl attitude." "She was probably thinking about how much more sophisticated Portland is," Connor added. "You know how these outsiders are. They come to our town and immediately start judging us like we're a bunch of backwards mountain people. Maybe we should give her a proper Riverside High welcome." Ryan's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever Jake was suggesting. "You know, help her understand how things work around here." Emma's blood ran cold. She had heard this type of conversation before, usually right before someone's life got significantly more complicated. Every instinct told her to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, and hope that whatever they were planning would blow over. But her feet seemed rooted to the sidewalk as Jake continued talking. "I'm thinking something public," Jake said, his voice taking on the calculated tone of someone planning a campaign. "Something that puts her in her place, without crossing any lines that would get us in real trouble. We want to teach her a lesson, not end up in the principal's office." "What did you have in mind?" Connor asked, and Emma could hear the eager anticipation in his voice. "You'll see," Jake replied. "Tomorrow morning, first thing. Make sure you're both in the courtyard before first period. This is going to be good." Emma heard their footsteps moving away from the building, and she waited until she was certain they were gone, before stepping out from behind the wall. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel the familiar mixture of anger and determination that had gotten her into trouble more than once in Portland. Whatever Jake Thompson was planning, she was now forewarned. The question was whether that would be enough to help her avoid whatever trap he was setting. Walking toward the parking lot where her mother's old Honda waited, Emma reflected on Sensei Williams' final lesson before she left Portland. True strength, Emma-san, is not about defeating your opponent. True strength is about choosing your battles wisely, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and never using your skills for anything other than justice. Remember that the greatest victory is often the fight you never have to fight. Tomorrow, Emma thought as she climbed into the passenger seat of her mother's car, she would find out whether her sensei's wisdom would be enough to navigate the social minefield of Riverside High School. But deep in her heart, she suspected that her 8 years of training were about to be put to the ultimate test. Maria Rodriguez was humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast the next morning, moving efficiently around their small kitchen while the coffee maker gurgled to life. The apartment they had rented was modest but clean, with large windows that caught the early morning light streaming down from the mountains. After months of 12-hour shifts at Portland General, the regular day schedule at Millbrook General Hospital felt like a luxury, even if the pay was slightly less than what she had been making in the city. "How did you sleep, Mija?" she asked as Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her dark hair still tousled from sleep. Maria noticed the slight tension in her daughter's shoulders, the way Emma's eyes seemed focused somewhere beyond the present moment. After 16 years of motherhood, she had learned to read the subtle signs of her daughter's moods. "Fine," Emma replied, though the word came out a little too quickly to be entirely convincing. She accepted the plate of scrambled eggs and toast that her mother offered, settling into one of the mismatched chairs they had picked up at a second-hand store during their first week in Millbrook. "Just thinking about today, I guess." Maria studied her daughter's face as she sipped her coffee. Emma had always been introspective, prone to working through problems internally rather than talking them through out loud. It was a trait that had served her well during their difficult years after Emma's father left, but it also meant that Maria sometimes had to work harder to understand what was troubling her only child. "Second days are often harder than first days," Maria observed gently. "The novelty has worn off, but you haven't quite found your rhythm yet. It's normal to feel unsettled." She sat down across from Emma, cradling her coffee mug in both hands. "Did something specific happen yesterday that's bothering you?" Emma considered telling her mother about the incident in the cafeteria, about the terrified freshman boy and his broken phone, about the conversation she had overheard behind the gymnasium. But she could see the hope in Maria's eyes, the careful optimism of a woman who had sacrificed considerably to give them both a fresh start. Her mother had left behind friends, familiar routines, and a network of colleagues she trusted, all for the promise of better opportunities in a place where they could build something new together. "Nothing happened," Emma said finally, "just adjusting to the different pace, the smaller school environment. Everyone seems to know everyone else, and I'm still figuring out how to fit in." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. She took a bite of eggs, chewing slowly while her mother watched her with the patient attention of someone who knew when to push for more information and when to let things develop naturally. The drive to school took them through downtown Millbrook, past the hardware store where Emma had seen Jake Thompson's father loading lumber into a massive pickup truck, past the diner where many of the high school students gathered after football games, past the small park where families brought their children to play on the outdated but well-maintained equipment. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from their cars, where the bank president knew the names of everyone who worked at the grocery store, where 3 generations of the same family might attend the same church every Sunday. "I like it here," Maria said as they passed the hospital where she worked, a modern building that stood out among the older architecture of the downtown area. "The people are genuine, and there's something peaceful about being able to see the mountains from everywhere you go. I think we're going to be happy here, Emma." Emma nodded, managing a smile that felt almost genuine. She wanted to share her mother's optimism, wanted to believe that Millbrook could become the sanctuary that Maria envisioned. But the conversation she had overheard the previous afternoon echoed in her mind, along with the memory of Jake Thompson's calculating expression as he planned whatever humiliation he intended to inflict on her. The student parking lot was busier than it had been the day before, filled with the usual collection of hand-me-down sedans, carefully maintained pickup trucks, and the occasional luxury vehicle that marked its owner as part of Millbrook's small but influential upper class. Emma spotted Jake's pristine black Jeep immediately, parked in a spot that seemed designed to maximize its visibility to anyone entering or leaving the building. "Have a good day, Mija," Maria said as Emma gathered her backpack. "Remember, if you need anything, you can always call me at the hospital. I'm only 10 minutes away." Emma kissed her mother's cheek and climbed out of the Honda, watching as Maria drove away with a cheerful wave. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and the promise of the first snow that would arrive within a few weeks. Under different circumstances, Emma might have appreciated the beauty of her surroundings, but today the mountains seemed to loom over the school like silent witnesses to whatever drama was about to unfold. The hallways were more crowded than they had been during her arrival the previous morning, filled with students catching up on homework, gossiping about weekend plans, and generally preparing for another day of academic and social navigation. Emma made her way to her locker, hyper-aware of the voices and movements around her. She had learned in Portland to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was currently screaming that something was wrong. Sophie Chen appeared at Emma's elbow as she was organizing her books for the morning's classes. "You look like someone who didn't sleep well," Sophie observed, her voice quiet enough that it wouldn't carry to the students at neighboring lockers. "Everything okay?" "Just new school jitters," Emma replied, though she appreciated Sophie's concern. In the 24 hours since they had met, Sophie had proven to be exactly the kind of person Emma valued: observant, kind, and comfortable, with silence when conversation felt forced. "How long does it usually take to stop feeling like an outsider?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "For me, about 6 months before people stop thinking of me as the new girl. But I think it depends on how much attention you attract, good or bad. The kids who blend in get accepted faster than the ones who stand out." She paused, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Speaking of standing out, Jake Thompson has been asking people about you." Emma's hands stilled. "On her geometry textbook, what kind of questions? Where you came from, what your family situation is, whether you think you're too good for Millbrook. The usual interrogation he does when someone new shows up. But he's been more persistent than normal." Sophie's expression grew worried. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I heard him talking to Connor and Ryan yesterday after school. Something about teaching you the local customs." The warning bell rang before Emma could respond, and students began moving toward their first period classrooms with the reluctant energy of teenagers facing another day of mandatory education. Emma and Sophie joined the flow of bodies moving through the hallways, but Emma's mind was racing as she processed Sophie's information. Jake's questions suggested that he was gathering intelligence, preparing for something more elaborate than a simple confrontation. Mrs. Anderson's English class proceeded normally, with a discussion of the symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird that felt surreal given Emma's current preoccupation with real-world injustice and the complicated nature of standing up for what was right. Emma found herself thinking about Atticus, Finch's quiet courage, about the way he had chosen to do the right thing, despite knowing it would make him unpopular in his community. Sensei Williams had often talked about moral courage, about the responsibility that came with possessing the skills to defend oneself and others. "Miss Rodriguez, what do you think about Atticus's decision to defend Tom Robinson, knowing how it would affect his family's standing in Maycomb?" Mrs. Anderson's question pulled Emma back to the present moment. Emma looked up to find the entire class watching her, waiting for her response. "I think he understood that some things are more important than being popular or fitting in," she said slowly. "If you have the ability to do the right thing and you choose not to because it's inconvenient or risky, then you're part of the problem." Mrs. Anderson nodded approvingly, but Emma noticed several of her classmates exchanging glances. In a small school like Riverside High, where social harmony often took precedence over individual principles, Her answer probably sounded naive or idealistic. But Emma had learned from her sensei that strength without moral foundation was just violence waiting for an excuse. The morning passed without incident, though Emma noticed Jake Thompson and his friends seemed to be present in every hallway she walked through, always positioned where they could observe her movements without making their surveillance obvious. It was a subtle form of psychological pressure designed to make her feel watched and evaluated constantly. By the time lunch period arrived, Emma's nerves were stretched taut with anticipation. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual chaos of competing conversations, clattering trays, and the general cacophony of 400 teenagers trying to refuel and socialize simultaneously. Emma grabbed a salad and a bottle of juice, scanning the room for Sophie's familiar face near the windows. But as she turned from the lunch line, she found her path blocked by Connor Walsh's lanky frame. "Hey there, new girl," Connor said, his voice carrying just enough volume to attract attention from nearby tables. His red hair caught the fluorescent lighting, and his smile had the sharp edges of someone who enjoyed other people's discomfort. "Jake wants to talk to you." Emma looked past Connor to where Jake Thompson sat at his usual table, surrounded by his court of admirers and hangers-on. Jake was watching their interaction with the focused intensity of a predator, sizing up potential prey. Ryan Mitchell sat beside him, looking uncomfortable but making no move to intervene. "I'm sure he does," Emma replied calmly, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "But I don't particularly want to talk to him." Connor's smile widened, as if her response was exactly what he had been hoping for. "That's not really how things work around here. When Jake Thompson wants to talk to you, you go talk to Jake Thompson. It's just good manners." The conversations at nearby tables had begun to die down as students sensed the potential for drama. Emma could feel dozens of eyes watching the interaction, waiting to see how the new girl would handle her first real confrontation with the school's established hierarchy. She thought about Sensei Williams' teachings about de-escalation, about finding ways to avoid conflict without appearing weak or afraid. "I appreciate the invitation," Emma said, shifting her weight slightly to a more balanced stance without making the movement obvious. "But I prefer to eat my lunch in peace. Maybe another time." She started to step around Connor, but he moved to block her path again, his smile taking on a harder edge. "I don't think you understand. Jake doesn't usually invite people twice." His voice carried a note of threat that was subtle enough to avoid attracting teacher attention, but clear enough that everyone within earshot understood the implications. Emma felt the familiar calm settling over her, the centered stillness that came from years of training in controlled confrontation. Her sensei had taught her to recognize the moments when violence became inevitable, when all attempts at peaceful resolution had been exhausted. But she also knew that those moments were rarer than most people believed, that patience and strategic thinking could often find solutions that brute force could not. "Connor, is it?" Emma asked, as if they were having a perfectly normal conversation. "I'm going to walk around you now and sit with my friend. If you choose to make this into something bigger than it needs to be, that's your decision. But I'm not looking for trouble with anyone." For a moment, Connor seemed uncertain, as if her calm response had thrown off whatever script he had prepared. But then Jake's voice carried across the cafeteria, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Connor, bring our new friend over here. I think it's time we all got properly acquainted." The direct command from Jake seemed to restore Connor's confidence. He grabbed Emma's arm just above the elbow, not hard enough to cause pain, but firmly enough to make his intentions clear. "Come on, Portland. Time to learn how we do things in Colorado." Emma looked down at Connor's hand on her arm, then back, up at his face. In that moment, she felt the weight of 8 years of training, of countless hours spent learning not just how to fight, but when fighting was justified. Sensei Williams had been very clear about the circumstances that warranted physical response. Immediate danger to yourself or others, no possibility of escape or de-escalation, and the certainty that your opponent had committed to violence regardless of your actions. Connor's grip tightened as he began to pull her toward Jake's table, and Emma made her decision. In one smooth motion, she twisted her arm in the direction of Connor's thumb, the weakest part of his grip, while simultaneously stepping slightly to the side. The technique was so basic that she had learned it in her first month of training, but executed properly, it was completely unstoppable. Connor found himself holding empty air as Emma freed herself effortlessly, his momentum carrying him forward slightly as he tried to process what had just happened. The entire cafeteria had gone silent, 400 students watching in fascination, as the quiet transfer student demonstrated that she was not as helpless as she appeared. "Like I said," Emma continued in the same calm tone, as if nothing had happened, "I prefer to eat my lunch in peace." She walked around Connor's stunned form and made her way to Sophie's table, aware that every eye in the room was following her movement. Behind her, she could hear Jake Thompson's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up, could sense the shift in the room's energy as the confrontation escalated beyond what anyone had expected. "That was either very brave or very stupid," Sophie whispered as Emma sat down across from her. "Jake doesn't like being embarrassed in front of an audience." Emma unwrapped her salad with steady hands, though her heart was racing. Sometimes there's not much difference between brave and stupid. You just have to hope you can tell which one you're being while you're doing it. The rest of lunch passed in tense quiet, with Jake and his friends having an intense conversation at their table, while throwing periodic glances in Emma's direction. By the time the bell rang for fifth period, Emma knew that whatever Jake had been planning for her welcome to Riverside High had just become significantly more complicated. Walking through the hallways toward her next class, Emma reflected on the irony of her situation. She had spent the last 8 years learning to defend herself and others, had trained her body and mind to respond effectively to exactly the kind of situation she now found herself in. But she had also promised her mother to avoid trouble, to keep her head down and focus on building a new life in Millbrook. The problem was that trouble seemed determined to find her, regardless of her intentions. And as she had learned from both her sensei and her own experience, sometimes the only way to truly avoid a fight was to demonstrate that you were prepared to win one. The afternoon classes crawled by with the peculiar tension that follows a public confrontation, when everyone knows that the initial skirmish was just the opening move in a larger conflict. Emma tried to focus on her chemistry equations and her Spanish vocabulary, but part of her mind remained alert for any sign that Jake Thompson was escalating his campaign against her. It wasn't until the final bell rang and students began streaming toward the exits that Emma realized Jake's real plan. As she walked toward the student parking lot where her mother would pick her up, she noticed that her usual route was blocked by a small crowd of students gathered in the courtyard between the main building and the gymnasium. The crowd seemed focused on something happening in the center of the group, and Emma could hear Jake Thompson's voice rising above the general murmur of conversation. Against her better judgment, Emma found herself drawn toward the gathering, her curiosity overriding her instinct to avoid whatever drama was unfolding. As she got closer, she could see that Jake and his friends had cornered someone against the brick wall of the building, someone smaller than them who seemed to be trying to back away from the confrontation. Emma's blood ran cold as she recognized the scrawny freshman boy from the previous day's cafeteria incident, the same kid whose lunch had been destroyed and whose phone had been broken. He looked even more terrified today, if that was possible, and Emma could see that his hands were shaking as Jake loomed over him. "I heard you've been telling people that I'm a bully," Jake was saying, his voice carrying easily to the gathered students. "That's a pretty serious accusation, freshman. Makes me wonder if maybe you need another lesson in how things work around here." Emma pushed through the crowd until she had a clear view of what was happening. The freshman boy was pressed against the wall, looking like he wished he could disappear entirely. Several students had their phones out, obviously recording whatever was about to happen. Teachers were noticeably absent from the courtyard, probably dealing with the usual end-of-day chaos inside the building. "I didn't tell anyone anything," the boy stammered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "I just want to go home." "Lee, see, that's the problem," Connor Walsh chimed in, positioning himself to block any potential escape route. "You're not acting grateful for the lessons we've been teaching you. Maybe we need to try a different approach." Emma watched Jake's face, saw the calculating expression she was beginning to recognize as his planning mode. This wasn't random bullying. This was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to send a message to the entire school about what happened to people who didn't show proper respect to the established hierarchy. But as Emma observed the scene, she realized that the freshman boy wasn't the only target of Jake's demonstration. Jake's eyes kept flicking toward her position in the crowd, gauging her reaction to what was happening. This whole confrontation was as much about testing her as it was about intimidating the younger student. "You know what I think?" Jake continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was enjoying himself. "I think you need to learn some respect, and I think our new friend from Portland needs to see how we handle troublemakers in Millbrook." Emma felt the familiar surge of anger that always preceded her most difficult decisions. Sensei Williams had taught her that anger could be useful if it was controlled and directed properly, but that it could also cloud judgment and lead to actions that caused more harm than good. The question was whether this situation warranted the risk of revealing her capabilities, of abandoning the low profile she had tried to maintain. As Jake stepped closer to the terrified freshman, Emma made her choice. Some things were more important than staying out of trouble. The autumn air in the courtyard felt electric with tension as Emma watched Jake Thompson close the distance between himself and the trembling freshman. The circle of students had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of potential conflict that seemed to override any sense of moral obligation to intervene. Most of them held their phones at the ready, preparing to capture whatever humiliation Jake had planned for his latest victim. Emma recognized the expression on Jake's face from her years of training with Sensei Williams. It was the look of someone who had already decided to commit to violence, who was now simply choosing the method and timing of their attack. The freshman boy seemed to sense it too, pressing himself flatter against the brick wall as if he could somehow disappear into the mortar between the stones. "Last chance, freshman," Jake said, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of someone who had already made up his mind. "Apologize for spreading lies about me, and maybe this doesn't have to get ugly." The boy's voice cracked as he tried to respond. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Please just let me go home." Connor Walsh laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the afternoon air. "Too late for sorry. Should have thought about that before you started running your mouth." He glanced over at Emma, making sure she was watching, then back at Jake with an expression of eager anticipation. Emma felt the familiar stillness settling over her mind, the centered calm that came from years of meditation and controlled breathing exercises. Sensei Williams had taught her to recognize this state, to use it as a foundation for clear thinking and precise action. In this moment of perfect clarity, she could see exactly what was about to happen and exactly what her options were. Jake reached out and grabbed the freshman's backpack, yanking it off the boy's shoulders with enough force to send him stumbling forward. "Let's see what other secrets little Bobby Martinez is hiding," Jake announced to his audience, unzipping the backpack and beginning to pull out its contents. Textbooks, notebooks, and pens scattered across the concrete as Jake made a show of examining each item before tossing it aside. "Ooh, look at this," Connor said, snatching a photograph that had fallen from one of the notebooks. "Family picture. Oh, that's sweet. Big family dinner, everyone looks so happy." He held the photo up for the crowd to see, then made a show of examining it more closely. "Wait, is this your little sister? She's kind of cute. Maybe I should ask her out when she gets to high school." The freshman boy's face went pale, then flushed red with a mixture of humiliation and rage. "Leave my family alone," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the confrontation began. "They didn't do anything to you." Jake smiled, sensing that he had found the pressure point he was looking for. "Family's important, isn't it, Bobby? Makes you want to protect them, fight for them, even when you know you're going to lose." He took the photograph from Connor and held it just out of the boy's reach. "Tell you what, you get down on your hands and knees and crawl around this courtyard like the little worm you are, and I'll give you your precious family photo back." The crowd stirred uneasily at Jake's demand. Even by Riverside High's standards, this was crossing a line that made some of the watching students uncomfortable. But none of them moved to intervene, and several continued recording with their phones, capturing every moment of Bobby Martinez's humiliation for posterity. Emma watched Bobby's face as he processed Jake's ultimatum. She could see the war between dignity and desperation playing out in his expression, could recognize the terrible calculus that victims of bullying were forced to make every day. How much of yourself were you willing to sacrifice to avoid worse consequences? How far would you allow someone to push you before the cost of submission became greater than the cost of resistance? "I'm not going to crawl for you," Bobby said finally, his voice barely above a whisper but audible enough for everyone to hear. "You can keep the picture." Jake's expression darkened at the unexpected defiance. "Wrong answer, freshman." It tore the photograph in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like confetti. "Maybe next time you'll remember that cooperation is always the smart choice." Emma had seen enough. Moving with the fluid grace that came from years of training, she stepped through the circle of watching students and into the center of the confrontation. "That's enough," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that followed her intervention. Jake turned to face her, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation to something that might have been pleasure. Well, look who decided to join the party. I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to get involved." Emma ignored Jake's taunt, instead kneeling to help Bobby gather the scattered contents of his backpack. The boy looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and fear, clearly torn between relief at having someone come to his aid and terror at the thought of what Jake might do to both of them now. "You don't have to do this," Bobby whispered as Emma handed him his chemistry textbook. "He'll just make it worse for both of us." "Maybe," Emma replied softly, "but some things are worth the risk." She stood up slowly, positioning herself between Bobby and Jake's crew. "Bobby, why don't you head home? I think this conversation is over." Connor Walsh stepped forward, blocking Bobby's path to the parking lot. "Nobody said you could leave. Freshman, we're not done with our little chat." Emma turned to face Connor, her dark eyes steady and calm. "Yes, you are. Bobby's going home now, and you're going to let him go." The watching students seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that the confrontation was about to escalate beyond verbal intimidation. Emma could feel their attention like a physical weight, could sense the smartphones continuing to record every moment of the drama unfolding in the courtyard. Jake laughed, the sound carrying a note of genuine amusement. "This is perfect. The new girl thinks she's some kind of hero, riding to the rescue of defenseless freshmen. Tell me, Portland, what exactly do you think you're going to do if we decide we're not finished here? Emma met Jake's gaze steadily, remembering Sensei Williams's teachings about the importance of projecting confidence even in the face of superior numbers. I'm going to ask you politely to let Bobby go home to his family. After that, if you want to continue this conversation, we can do it without involving him. Ryan Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Jake and Emma with an expression that suggested he was beginning to have second thoughts about whatever they had planned. Maybe we should just let it go, Jake. We made our point. Jake's expression hardened as he registered what he probably interpreted as disloyalty from one of his closest followers. Our point isn't made until I say it's made, Ryan. And right. Now I'm thinking our new friend needs to learn the same lesson as Bobby here. Connor grinned and cracked his knuckles, obviously relishing the prospect of physical confrontation. Should have minded your own business, Portland. Now you get to find out what happens to people who don't understand how things work in Millbrook. Emma felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat, but her mind remained perfectly clear and focused. 8 years of training had taught her to use fear and excitement as fuel rather than distraction, to channel the energy of confrontation into precise action and strategic thinking. Bobby, she said without taking her eyes off Jake, start walking toward the parking lot. Don't run, don't look back, just walk. The freshman boy hesitated for a moment, then began moving slowly toward the edge of the courtyard. Connor started to intercept him, but Emma shifted slightly, placing herself more directly in Connor's path. Your problem is with me now, Emma said calmly. Let him go. Jake's smile widened as he recognized that Emma had just committed herself to a confrontation she couldn't avoid. You know what? I like you, Portland. You've got guts, even if you don't have much sense. Tell you what, I'll make you the same. Deal, I offered Bobby. Get down on your hands and knees, crawl around this courtyard a few times, and we'll call it even. The watching students stirred at Jake's proposal, some of them looking uncomfortable with the escalating cruelty of the situation. But Emma noticed that none of them made any move to intervene or seek help from the teachers inside the building. Fear of social retaliation was a powerful force in a small school like Riverside High, where today's hero could easily become tomorrow's target. I don't think so, Emma replied, her voice still perfectly calm despite the racing of her heart. But I appreciate the offer. Jake's expression darkened at her refusal. Wrong choice, new girl. Connor, Ryan, I think it's time our friend learned some respect. Connor stepped forward eagerly, but Ryan remained where he was, his face troubled. Jake, maybe we should think about this. She hasn't actually done anything to us. She's done enough, Jake snapped. She embarrassed Connor in the cafeteria. She's interfering with our business now, and she clearly thinks she's better than the rest of us. Time for a reality check. Emma watched Connor approach, noting his gangly build and the way he carried his shoulders high with tension. His movements had the awkward aggression of someone who was used to intimidating people through size and reputation rather than actual fighting skill. She could see several obvious weaknesses in his stance and posture, target areas that Sensei Williams had drilled into her consciousness through thousands of repetitions. Last chance to reconsider, Connor said, rolling his shoulders and flexing his hands. Jake's being generous, but his patience isn't infinite. Emma shifted her weight to a more balanced stance, the movement so subtle that most of the watching students probably didn't notice it. But her body was now perfectly positioned to move in any direction, to respond to attack from multiple angles, to generate maximum power from minimum motion. I've considered it carefully, Emma said, and my answer is still no. Connor lunged forward with the graceless aggression of someone who had never faced real resistance, reaching out to grab Emma's shoulders with both hands. It was exactly the kind of sloppy, overcommitted attack that Sensei Williams had taught her to exploit. The kind of opening that made complex techniques unnecessary. Emma sidestepped Connor's charge with minimal effort, using his own momentum against him as she guided his reaching hands past her body. A simple hip throw, executed with perfect timing and leverage, sent Connor tumbling to the concrete with a surprised grunt. The entire movement looked almost effortless, as if Connor had somehow thrown himself to the ground while Emma merely watched. The courtyard fell silent, except for the sound of Connor groaning and trying to figure out how he had ended up on his back. Emma remained perfectly balanced, her breathing steady and controlled, looking as calm as if she had just stepped aside to avoid a puddle. "Connor!" Jake's voice cracked with surprise and anger. "Get up!" Connor rolled over and pushed himself to his hands and knees, his face red with embarrassment and confusion. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, glaring up at Emma as if she had somehow cheated. "Basic physics," Emma replied calmly. "You were moving forward with a lot of momentum, and I just helped you continue in that direction." Jake's expression had shifted from confidence to calculation as he processed what he had just witnessed. Connor was supposed to be the enforcer, the one who handled physical confrontations when intimidation wasn't enough. Seeing him dumped on the ground by the quiet transfer student had clearly not been part of the plan. "Interesting," Jake said slowly. "Looks like Portland has some surprises. Ryan, your turn." Ryan looked even more uncomfortable than before, glancing between Emma's calm expression and Connor's humiliated anger. "Jake, I really think we should just call it even. She didn't hurt Connor, just embarrassed him a little." "Ryan," your voice carried a note of warning that suggested their friendship would not survive any further displays of reluctance. "Handle this. Now." Ryan sighed and stepped forward, his movements reluctant but determined. Unlike Connor's wild charge, Ryan approached more cautiously, his basketball player's reflexes keeping him balanced and ready to react. Emma could see that he had at least some experience with physical confrontation, enough to recognize that she was more dangerous than she appeared. "I don't want to hurt you," Ryan said as he closed the distance between them. "But Jake's right about one thing. You can't just come to our school and think you can change the way things work." Emma studied Ryan's approach, noting the way he kept his hands up and his feet positioned for quick movement. He was clearly more skilled than Connor, but his heart wasn't in the fight. That hesitation would be his weakness, the moment of doubt that would create the opening she needed. "I'm not trying to change anything," Emma replied. "I just want people to be able to go to school without being afraid." Ryan shook his head sadly. "That's not how the world works. There are always people like Jake, and there are always people like Bobby. The best you can do is figure out which side you're on and hope you chose correctly." He moved forward with careful precision, reaching for Emma's wrist in what looked like an attempt to control her movement without causing injury. It was a more thoughtful approach than Connor's wild charge, but it still relied on the assumption that Emma would be passive or frightened in the face of physical confrontation. Emma allowed Ryan to make contact with her wrist, then demonstrated why 8 years of martial arts training made such assumptions dangerous. Using the connection he had created, she stepped in close and executed a simple arm drag that spun Ryan off balance and left him stumbling past her. A gentle push between. His shoulder blade sent him sprawling on the concrete next to Connor, more surprised than hurt, but clearly outmatched. The watching students were no longer murmuring among themselves. The courtyard had fallen completely silent as they processed the fact that the quiet new girl had just neutralized 2 of the school's most intimidating students without breaking. a sweat or even appearing to exert herself, Jake Thompson stared at his two friends, picking themselves up off the ground, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been respect. For the first time since Emma had arrived at Riverside High, he was looking at her as an individual rather than just another target for his entertainment. "Well," Jake said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine interest, "this is unexpected. Where exactly did you learn to do that, Portland?" Emma remained in her balanced stance, ready for whatever came next, but hoping that Jake was smart enough to recognize when a situation had moved beyond his control. "I learned that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Everything else is just details." Jake nodded slowly, as if he was processing information that didn't fit his usual categories. Dignity? Interesting concept. He looked around the courtyard at the watching students, at his two friends brushing dirt off their clothes, at Bobby Martinez, who had stopped at the edge of the parking lot to watch the conclusion of the confrontation. "You know what, Portland? I think we're going to have to continue this conversation later, under different circumstances." Jake's smile returned, but it had a different quality now, less predatory and more speculative. "This has been educational." Emma watched as Jake turned and walked away, Connor and Ryan trailing behind him with expressions of confusion and wounded pride. The crowd of students began to disperse, most of them talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Within hours, Emma knew the story would be all over school, probably growing more dramatic with each retelling. Bobby Martinez approached her cautiously, his backpack clutched tightly in both hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Emma replied, kneeling to pick up the torn pieces of his family photograph. "Everyone deserves to feel safe at school. I'm sorry about your picture." Bobby took the fragments of the photograph, handling them carefully as if they were precious artifacts. "It's okay. My mom has lots more copies. But thank you for standing up for me. Nobody's ever done that before." As Bobby walked away toward the parking lot, Emma realized that her carefully maintained low profile had just been shattered beyond repair. Emma walked toward the parking lot with measured steps, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of confrontation, but her mind already shifting toward the consequences of what had just happened. The familiar weight of her backpack felt heavier somehow, as if it now carried the burden of unwanted attention along with her textbooks and notebooks. She could feel eyes watching her from the dispersing crowd, could hear fragments of excited conversation floating on the crisp October air. Maria Rodriguez was waiting in their Honda Civic near the pickup area, scrolling through her phone while soft Mexican ballads played on the radio. She looked up as Emma approached the car, and her practiced maternal eye immediately caught the tension in her daughter's posture, the careful way Emma was controlling her breathing and movement. "How was your day, Misha?" Maria asked as Emma settled into the passenger seat, but her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wasn't going to be simple. Emma buckled her seatbelt and considered her response carefully. She could feel the weight of the day's events pressing against her consciousness, demanding to be processed and understood. The confrontation in the courtyard had been inevitable from the moment she chose to intervene on Bobby Martinez's behalf. But that didn't make the aftermath any less complicated. "Different," Emma said finally, watching through the windshield as students continued to stream out of the building. She could see Jake Thompson near his black Jeep, surrounded by his usual group of admirers, but his body language was different. Now, less commanding, more contemplative, Connor Walsh and Ryan Mitchell stood slightly apart from the main group, both of them looking like they were still trying to process their unexpected encounter with the concrete. Maria pulled out of the parking lot and onto the tree-lined street that led toward downtown Millbrook. The mountains loomed ahead of them, their peaks already dusted with the season's first snow, beautiful and imposing against the late afternoon sky. Different how? She asked gently, using the tone she had perfected over 16 years of motherhood when she sensed Emma was working through something important. Emma watched the familiar landmarks of their new town scroll past the window. The hardware store where Jake's father worked, the diner where high school students gathered on Friday nights, the small park where families brought their children to play. It was the kind of place where news traveled fast, where a single incident could define your reputation for years to come. Some kids were picking on a freshman, Emma said, choosing her words carefully. I helped him out. It might have caused some complications. Maria's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, a sign that she was processing the implications of Emma's deliberately understated explanation. What kind of complications? Emma closed her eyes and tried to find a way to explain the situation without causing her mother unnecessary worry. After everything Maria had sacrificed to give them a fresh start in Millbrook, the last thing Emma wanted was to burden her with the knowledge that their carefully planned new beginning was already becoming complicated. The kids who were bothering him are popular, influential. They didn't appreciate the interference. Emma opened her eyes and looked at her mother's profile, noting the slight furrow between her eyebrows that appeared whenever Maria was trying to solve a problem with insufficient information. I handled it, but it probably means they're going to pay more attention to me now. Maria pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex and turned off the engine, but she didn't immediately move to get out of the car. Instead, she turned to face Emma directly, her dark eyes serious and concerned. When you say you handled it, what exactly does that mean? Maria's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who was trying not to jump to conclusions while still gathering the information she needed to protect her child. Emma met her mother's gaze steadily, recognizing that this was one of those moments when partial truth would be more harmful than complete honesty. I used some of the techniques Sensei Williams taught me, not to hurt anyone, just to show them that I wasn't as helpless as they thought. Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and Emma could practically see her mother's mind racing through all the potential ramifications of what she had just learned. The hospital job that had brought them to Millbrook, the carefully rebuilt life they were trying to create, the promise of a peaceful, small-town existence where they could heal from the chaos and heartbreak of their previous years. Emma, we talked about this before we moved, Maria said finally, her voice gentle but firm. I know you have skills. I know you learned them for good reasons, but this town is different from Portland. People here have long memories, and they don't always understand the difference between self-defense and aggression. Emma nodded, understanding her mother's concerns even as she felt the familiar frustration of being asked to ignore injustice for the sake of convenience. I know, Mom. I tried to avoid it, tried to walk away and mind my own business, but they were tormenting a kid who couldn't defend himself, and they were doing it for an audience. Sometimes you can't just pretend you don't see what's happening. Maria reached over and took Emma's hand, squeezing it gently. I know, Mija. I know you have a good heart, and I know you were raised to stand up for people who need help. I just worry about the cost of doing the right thing in a place where we're still trying to find our footing. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them processing the implications of the day's events. Through the windshield, Emma could see other families going about their evening routines. Parents arriving home from work, children playing in the small playground area near the center of the complex. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, stable environment that Maria had dreamed of when she made the difficult decision to leave Portland. What happens now? Maria asked finally. Emma considered the question carefully. In her experience, confrontations, like the one in the courtyard, rarely ended with a single incident. Jake Thompson was not the type of person who would simply accept public humiliation and move on with his life. He would need to respond, to reassert his dominance in a way that restored his reputation and sent a clear message to anyone else who might consider challenging his authority. "I think they're going to test me," Emma said honestly. "Try to figure out how much of what happened today was luck and how much was skill. Jake Thompson doesn't seem like the kind of person who accepts defeat gracefully." Maria sighed, a sound that carried the weight of a single mother's constant worry about her child's safety and future. "Maybe I should talk to the principal. Let him know there might be some tension between you and these other students." Emma shook her head quickly. "That would make everything worse. If there's one thing bullies hate more than being stood up to, it's having adults get involved in their business. I can handle this, Mom. I just need you to trust me." They gathered their things and walked toward their apartment, Emma carrying her backpack and Maria balancing her purse and a bag of groceries she had picked up during her lunch break. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace, the first harbinger of the long mountain winter that was approaching. Their apartment was on the second floor of a modest building that had been constructed in the 1980s, with thin walls and outdated appliances, but large windows that caught the afternoon light beautifully. Emma had slowly begun to think of it as home, appreciating the way the space felt safe and contained after the chaos of their final months in Portland. Maria began preparing dinner while Emma settled at the small dining table to work on her homework. But both of them seemed distracted by the weight of unfinished conversation. The events of the day hung between them like a storm cloud, full of potential energy that could either dissipate harmlessly or explode into something more serious. "Emma," Maria said as she chopped vegetables for their evening meal, "I need you to promise me something." Emma looked up from her chemistry homework, noting the serious tone in her mother's voice. "What kind of promise?" "Promise me that if this situation escalates, if these boys try to hurt you or threaten you in any way, you'll tell me immediately. No matter what the consequences might be for our life here, your safety is more important than anything else." Emma studied her mother's face, seeing the genuine fear beneath the careful composure. Maria had already lost her husband to unexpected tragedy, had already endured the heartbreak of watching her family fall apart and struggle to rebuild itself. The thought of losing Emma to violence or conflict was probably her deepest nightmare. "I promise," Emma said, meaning it completely. "But Mom, you need to understand that I'm not going to let people hurt innocent kids just because it's inconvenient for us. If I see someone being bullied, I'm going to do something about it." Maria nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I know, Mija. It's one of the things I love most about you, even when it scares me to death. Just promise me you'll be smart about it." They ate dinner in companionable quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead. Emma found herself thinking about Sensei Williams and the long conversations they had shared about the responsibility that came with martial arts training. "Power without wisdom is just destruction waiting to happen," he had told her during one of their final sessions together. "But wisdom without the courage to act is just cowardice dressed up in fancy words." After dinner, Emma retreated to her room to finish her homework, but her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation in the courtyard. She replayed the sequence of events in her memory, analyzing her decisions and trying to determine if she could have handled the situation differently. The techniques she had used against Connor and Ryan had been basic, almost instinctive responses to their clumsy attacks. She hadn't needed to access the more advanced skills that Sensei Williams had spent years teaching her. But she knew that Jake Thompson was smarter than his two friends, more calculating and strategic in his approach to conflict. If he decided to escalate their confrontation, he would probably be more careful about how he went about it. He would look for ways to challenge her that didn't leave him vulnerable to the kind of public embarrassment he had just endured. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie Chen, who had apparently heard about the incident, despite not being present in the courtyard. "Are you okay? People are saying some crazy things about what happened after school." Emma typed back quickly, "I'm fine. What kind of things are people saying?" Sophie's response came almost immediately. "Everything from you being a secret ninja to Jake and his friends getting beaten up by a girl half their size. The stories are getting more dramatic every time someone tells them." Emma groaned quietly, recognizing that the exaggerated rumors were probably going to make her situation more complicated than it already was. In a small school like Riverside High, reputation was everything, and having her confrontation with Jake's crew blown out of proportion could attract exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid. "The truth is a lot more boring than the rumors," Emma texted back, "but thanks for checking on me." "Be careful tomorrow," Sophie replied. "Jake doesn't like being embarrassed, and he has a long memory for people who cross him." Emma set her phone aside and returned to her homework, but Sophie's warning echoed in her mind as she worked through her remaining assignments. She had no illusions about what tomorrow would bring. Jake Thompson would have spent the evening planning his response to the day's humiliation, and that response would probably be more sophisticated than Connor's wild charge or Ryan's half-hearted grab. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the windshields of cars in the parking lot and the mountains sharp and bright against the cloudless sky. Emma dressed carefully, choosing practical clothes that would allow her to move freely if the need arose. She tied her long hair back in a simple ponytail and made sure her sneakers were laced tightly. Maria was unusually quiet during breakfast, stealing glances at Emma over her coffee cup as if she was trying to memorize her daughter's face. "You don't have to go to school today," she said finally. "I could call in sick. We could drive up to Denver for the day, do some shopping, let things cool down." Emma appreciated her mother's concern, but running away from the situation would only make it worse in the long run. "I can't hide from this, Mom. If I don't show up today, it sends the message that I'm afraid of Jake and his friends. That would make them even more aggressive when I do come back." Maria nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic even if she didn't like the implications. "Just remember what you promised me. If things get dangerous, if you feel threatened in any way, you call me immediately." The drive to school was tense, with both Emma and her mother lost in their own worried thoughts. The parking lot looked the same as always, filled with the usual collection of student vehicles and early arriving teachers' cars. But Emma could sense the undercurrent of anticipation that ran through groups of students as they gathered near the building entrance. Word had definitely spread about yesterday's incident. Emma could see it in the way conversations stopped when she walked past, in the curious and sometimes fearful glances that followed her movement through the hallway. By the time she reached her locker, she felt like she was walking through a gauntlet of whispered speculation and exaggerated rumors. Sophie appeared at her side as Emma was organizing her books for the morning's classes. "The whole school is talking about you," Sophie said quietly. "Some people are saying you're some kind of martial arts expert. Others think Jake went easy on you because you're new. Everyone's wondering what's going to happen next." Emma sighed, recognizing that her attempt to maintain a low profile had been completely shattered. "What's going to happen next is that I'm going to go to class and try to get a decent education. Everything else is just drama." But even as she said the words, Emma knew that the situation was far from over. She could feel the weight of attention pressing down on her, could sense that Jake Thompson was somewhere in the building, probably planning his next move. The confrontation in the courtyard had been just the opening skirmish in what was likely to be a much longer and more complicated conflict. As she walked toward her first period English class, Emma found herself thinking about one of Sensei Williams' favorite sayings: "The best fight is the one you never have to fight. But the second best fight is the one you win so decisively that you never have to fight again." Today, Emma suspected, she was going to find out which category her situation with Jake Thompson was going to fall into. The morning classes passed in a haze of barely contained tension, with Emma acutely aware of the whispered conversations and sideways glances that followed her through the hallways of Riverside High. During first period English, Mrs. Anderson seemed to sense the undercurrent of drama surrounding her newest student, occasionally shooting concerned looks in Emma's direction while discussing the themes of courage and moral responsibility in To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony wasn't lost on Emma, who found herself wondering if Harper Lee had ever imagined her fictional characters would become metaphors for real-world high school politics. In second period chemistry, Mr. Peterson droned through a lecture on molecular bonds, while Emma tried to focus on taking notes. But her attention kept drifting to the way other students kept turning around to stare at her. The rumors about yesterday's confrontation had obviously grown more elaborate overnight, transforming her simple, defensive actions into something approaching legend. She caught fragments of whispered conversations. 3 guys at once, some kind of ninja training, didn't even break a sweat. Sophie Chen, who had been assigned as Emma's lab partner for the week, leaned over during their experiment with chemical reactions. "Jake hasn't shown up for any of his morning classes," she whispered while pretending to examine their test tube. "Connor and Ryan are here, but they're acting really weird, like they're waiting for something to happen." Emma carefully measured out the chemicals for their assigned reaction, her hands steady despite the adrenaline that had been coursing through her system since she woke up. Waiting for what? That's what everyone's trying to figure out. Jake's not the type to just disappear after something like yesterday. He's planning something, and everyone knows it. Sophie glanced around the lab to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Some people think he's going to bring his older brother into it. Marcus graduated 2 years ago, but he still lives in town and works for their dad's construction company. He's even bigger than Jake, and he has a reputation for settling scores." The information sent a chill down Emma's spine, though she tried not to let her concern show on her face. Involving family members would escalate the situation beyond anything she had prepared for, transforming a school conflict into something that could have serious real-world consequences. Sensei Williams had taught her to defend herself against attackers her own age and size, but an adult with professional fighting experience would present challenges she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. "Has anyone seen Jake's brother around?" "School?" Emma asked, continuing to work on their experiment while keeping her voice casual. Sophie shook her head. "Not yet, but the day's still young. Marcus usually works job sites during the day, but Jake could probably get him to come by during lunch or after school if he really wanted to make a statement." The bell rang for third period, and Emma gathered her books with the growing sense that she was walking through a carefully orchestrated drama where everyone except her knew what was supposed to happen next. The hallways buzzed with anticipation, students clustering in small groups and speaking in excited whispers about the ongoing conflict between the new girl and the school's established hierarchy. Geometry class provided a brief respite from the tension, as Mr. Peterson's math problems demanded enough concentration to distract Emma from her worries about Jake Thompson's mysterious absence. But even the familiar comfort of mathematical logic couldn't completely quiet the voice in her head that kept running through potential scenarios and escape routes. During the break between third and fourth periods, Emma made a detour to the restroom, partly for practical reasons and partly to have a few minutes away from the constant observation of her classmates. She was washing her hands when the door opened and 3 senior girls entered, their designer clothes and perfectly styled hair marking them as part of Riverside High's social elite. "Well, look who it is," said the tallest of the 3. A blonde girl with sharp features and cold blue eyes. Emma recognized her as Ashley Morrison, someone she had noticed sitting near Jake's table during lunch the previous day. The famous new girl who thinks she's some kind of action hero. Emma dried her hands carefully, using the mirror to keep track of all 3 girls while appearing to focus on her own reflection. "I don't think I'm any kind of hero. I just helped a kid who was being bullied." Ashley laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Oh, how noble, riding to the rescue of poor little Bobby Martinez. Tell me, Portland, what exactly makes you think you have the right to interfere with how we handle things in our school?" The second girl, a brunette with expensive jewelry and the kind of perfect makeup that took an hour to apply, stepped closer to Emma. Maybe she thinks because she knows a few kung fu moves, she can just waltz in here and change everything to suit her Portland sensibilities. Emma turned to face the 3 girls directly, noting their positioning and body language. They were trying to intimidate her through proximity and numbers, but none of them seemed prepared for actual physical confrontation. This was psychological warfare, an attempt to establish social dominance through implied threat rather than direct action. "I'm not trying to change anything," Emma said calmly. "I just don't like seeing people get hurt for other people's entertainment." So Ashley's expression hardened at Emma's refusal to be intimidated. "People like Bobby Martinez get hurt because they don't understand their place in the natural order. Jake and his friends maintain the balance that keeps this school functioning smoothly. When outsiders interfere with that balance, bad things happen to everyone." The third girl, a redhead with freckles and a nervous energy that suggested she was less comfortable with confrontation than her companions, glanced toward the restroom door as if checking for witnesses. "Maybe you should transfer to a different school," she suggested, her voice carrying less conviction than Ashley's threats. "Somewhere that appreciates your particular talents." Emma recognized the conversation for what it was. A warning delivered. By proxy, Jake's attempt to pressure her through his social network rather than direct confrontation. It was actually a smart strategy, demonstrating that his influence extended beyond his immediate circle of friends, while avoiding the kind of public spectacle that had backfired so dramatically the day before. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare," Emma replied, her tone politely neutral. "But I'm happy where I am. Millbrook seems like a nice place once you get past some of the local customs." Ashley's face flushed with anger at the implied criticism of their social structure. "Those local customs have worked fine for generations before you showed up. Maybe you should think about that before you decide to play hero again." The 3 girls left as suddenly as they had arrived, their message delivered with the kind of plausible deniability that would make it impossible to report to school authorities. Emma remained in the restroom for a few more minutes, processing the encounter and its implications. Jake was clearly expanding his campaign beyond direct confrontation, using his social connections to apply pressure from multiple angles. 4th period history class was taught by Coach Williams, a man in his 50s who doubled as the school's head football coach and clearly favored the athletic students who made up the core of his team. Emma noticed that Connor Walsh and Ryan Mitchell were both in this class, sitting together near the back of the room and shooting occasional glances in her direction. Coach Williams was discussing the causes of World War I when the classroom door opened and Jake Thompson walked in, carrying a late pass and looking like he had spent the morning doing something more important than attending classes. He took his usual seat near Connor and Ryan, and Emma could feel the energy in the room shift as students sensed that the main event of their ongoing drama was about to begin. "Sorry I'm late, Coach," Jake said with the easy confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. Had to help my dad with some business this morning. Coach Williams barely looked up from his lecture notes. Take your seat, Thompson. We're discussing the alliance system that led to the Great War, but Emma noticed that Jake wasn't paying attention to the history lesson. Instead, he was looking directly at her with an expression that was part calculation and part anticipation. When their eyes met, he smiled and gave her a small nod, as if acknowledging a worthy opponent before the start of a formal duel. The rest of the period crawled by with Emma hyper-aware of Jake's presence behind her, of the way Connor and Ryan kept whispering to each other, of the anticipatory tension that seemed to fill the classroom like static electricity before a thunderstorm. When the bell finally rang for lunch, Emma gathered her books slowly, letting most of the other students file out before she made her way toward the door. Jake intercepted her in the hallway just outside the classroom, falling into step beside her as she walked toward her locker. His two friends flanked them at a discreet distance, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to maintain the pretense of a casual conversation. "We need to talk," Jake said, his voice friendly but carrying an undertone that suggested this wasn't really a request. Emma continued walking at her normal pace, not speeding up or slowing down in response to his presence. "What about?" "About yesterday. About what happens next. About how we're going to coexist in this school without constantly stepping on each other's toes." Jake's smile was perfectly calibrated to appear reasonable to any teachers or administrators who might be watching, but Emma could see the cold calculation behind his eyes. They reached Emma's locker, and she began gathering the books she would need for her afternoon classes. "I thought we settled things yesterday. You stopped bothering Bobby Martinez, I stopped interfering with your business. Seemed like a fair resolution to me." Jake leaned against the locker next to hers, positioning himself so that their conversation would appear casual to anyone passing by. "See? That's where you're wrong, Portland. Yesterday didn't settle anything. Yesterday just showed everyone, in this school, that Jake Thompson could be embarrassed by the new girl. That's not a situation I can let stand." Emma closed her locker and turned to face Jake directly, noting that a small crowd of students had begun to gather at the edges of their conversation. Word was spreading quickly that the two main players in yesterday's drama were having a public discussion, and everyone wanted to witness whatever happened next. "So what exactly are you proposing?" Emma asked, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline beginning to build in her system. Jake's smile widened, as if he had been waiting for exactly that question. "I'm proposing that we settle this properly. No more ambushes, no more surprise confrontations. Just you and me after school, in a place where we won't be interrupted by teachers or administrators." The gathered students stirred with excitement at Jake's challenge, recognizing that they were witnessing the setup for what could be the most dramatic confrontation in Riverside High's recent history. Emma could see phones being discreetly pulled out, students positioning themselves to record whatever happened next. "And if I refuse?" Emma asked, though she already knew what the answer would be. "Then everyone in this school will know that the girl who embarrassed Connor and Ryan was too scared to face me when it really mattered. Your reputation will be finished before it even got started, and Bobby Martinez and anyone else who thinks you might protect them will learn just how wrong they were." Emma recognized the trap that Jake had constructed with careful precision. Refusing his challenge would destroy any credibility she might have gained from yesterday's confrontation, marking her as someone who could only win fights when she had the element of surprise. Accepting would mean walking into a situation that Jake had undoubtedly planned with much more care than Connor and Ryan's impulsive attacks. But as Emma looked at the faces of the students gathered around them, she saw something that made her decision easier. Fear. Not fear of Jake Thompson, though that was certainly present, but fear of what would happen to them if they couldn't. Count on someone being willing to stand up to bullies when it mattered. Yesterday's confrontation had given them hope that the established order could be challenged, that people like Bobby Martinez didn't have to accept humiliation as the price of getting an education. Where and when? Emma asked, her voice carrying clearly enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. Jake's expression shifted to one of genuine respect, as if he hadn't expected her to accept his challenge so readily. The old maintenance building, behind the gym, right after school lets out, just you and me, no weapons, no interference from anyone else. Emma nodded once, sealing the agreement that would determine not just her own fate at Riverside High, but the fate of every student who had ever been bullied, intimidated, or humiliated by those who mistook cruelty for strength. "See you there," she said simply, then turned and walked toward the cafeteria, leaving Jake and his gathering audience to process the implications of what had just been arranged. The word spread through the school with the speed that only truly dramatic news could achieve. By the time Emma reached the cafeteria, it seemed like every student in Riverside High knew about the challenge that had been issued and accepted. Conversations stopped when she walked past tables, then resumed in excited whispers as students debated the likely outcome of the confrontation. Sophie was waiting at their usual table near the windows, her face pale with worry. "Tell me you didn't just agree to fight Jake Thompson after school." Emma sat down with her lunch tray, trying to project more confidence than she actually felt. "I agreed to meet him and resolve our differences. What happens from there depends on him." "Emma, this is insane. Jake is 6 inches taller than you and probably outweighs you by 50 pounds. Even if you have some martial arts training, there's a huge difference between throwing Connor and Ryan around and facing someone like Jake in a real fight." Emma appreciated Sophie's concern, but she had already committed to the confrontation. And backing out now would have consequences that extended far beyond her own reputation. "Sometimes you have to take risks to protect the things that matter. If I don't face Jake now, he'll just keep escalating until someone gets seriously hurt." The rest of lunch passed in a blur of nervous anticipation, with students constantly approaching their table to ask questions about the upcoming confrontation or to offer unsolicited advice about Jake's fighting style and probable strategies. Emma tried to eat her sandwich and focus on staying calm, but the weight of everyone's expectations pressed down on her like a physical burden. The afternoon classes were a waste of time academically, as neither Emma nor any of her classmates could concentrate on their lessons with the drama of the pending confrontation hanging over everything. Teachers tried to maintain normal classroom routines, but even they seemed to sense that something significant was building toward a conclusion. When the final bell rang at 3:15, Emma gathered her things slowly, using the extra time to center herself mentally and prepare for whatever was waiting at the old maintenance building. She had faced challenges before, had been forced to defend herself against older and stronger opponents during her years of training with Sensei Williams. But this felt different, more consequential, as if the outcome would determine not just her own future, but the future of every student who had ever been made to feel powerless in the face of institutional bullying. Walking across the campus toward the maintenance building, Emma found herself thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. Her father's abandonment, her mother's sacrifice to give them a fresh start, Sensei Williams' patient instruction in the principles of martial arts, and her own growing understanding that sometimes the only way to create peace was to demonstrate a willingness to fight for it. The maintenance building sat at the edge of the school property, a squat concrete structure that had been built in the 1960s and showed its age in every weathered surface and rusted fixture. A crowd had already gathered in the open area behind the building, students forming a loose circle around the space where the confrontation would take place. Jake Thompson stood in the center of the circle, having shed his Letterman jacket to reveal the impressive musculature that came from years of football training and weightlifting. He was stretching his shoulders and neck, going through the same routine Emma had seen him perform before football practices. Connor and Ryan flanked him, both looking nervous but excited about the prospect of watching their friend restore the natural order that Emma had disrupted. Emma walked through the crowd with steady steps, ignoring the comments and speculation that followed her movement. Some students were obviously hoping to see her get beaten down, viewing her as an outsider who needed to be put in her place. Others seemed to be rooting for her, perhaps remembering their own experiences with bullying and hoping that someone would finally stand up to the system that had made their lives miserable. Sophie pushed through the crowd to reach Emma's side, her face tight with worry. "It's not too late to walk away from this. Jake would probably let you leave town with your dignity intact if you apologized publicly." Emma shook her head, her eyes focused on Jake's confident posture and calculating expression. "Some things are more important than dignity. Some things are worth fighting for even when you're not sure you can win." She stepped into the center of the circle, feeling the weight of dozens of watching eyes and knowing that what happened in the next few minutes would be talked about at Riverside High for years to come. Jake Thompson smiled as she approached, the expression carrying equal parts respect and anticipation. "Last chance to back down, Portland," he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've got nothing personal against you, but I can't let yesterday's embarrassment stand. This school has an order, and that order depends on everyone understanding their place in it." Emma looked around the circle of watching faces, seeing the mixture of fear, excitement, and desperate hope that filled the eyes of her classmates. These were the people she would be fighting for, the students who deserved to feel safe in their own school without having to constantly worry about the whims of those who mistook power for leadership. "I understand," Emma said quietly, settling into the balanced stance that Sensei Williams had drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice. "Let's finish this." The October air behind the maintenance building carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and Emma could see her breath in small puffs as she steadied herself in the center of the circle. The crowd of students pressed closer, their excited chatter dying down to hushed whispers as they sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Phone cameras were raised like digital witnesses, ready to capture whatever happened next for immediate broadcast across social media platforms. Jake Thompson rolled his shoulders one final time, his blue eyes locked on Emma's face with the kind of focused intensity she had learned to recognize in serious fighters. Unlike Connor's wild aggression or Ryan's reluctant compliance, Jake moved with the controlled confidence of someone who had been in real physical confrontations before. His football training showed in every line of his body, from his balanced stance to the way he held his hands loose but ready at his sides. "You sure about this, Portland?" Jake asked, his voice carrying across the open space with practice projection. "I'm giving you one last opportunity to walk away from something that's going to end badly for you." Emma felt the familiar stillness settling over her mind, the centered calm that came from years of meditation and breathing exercises under Sensei Williams' patient guidance. Every lesson she had ever learned seemed to crystallize in this moment, from the basic stances she had practiced as an 8-year-old to the advanced techniques that had earned her second-degree black belt status just months before leaving Oregon. "I'm sure," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "But Jake, I want you to understand something before we do this. I don't want to hurt you. I just want the bullying to stop." Jake laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement rather than mockery. "Hurt me? Portland, I appreciate your confidence, but you're about to learn the difference between picking on Connor and Ryan when they weren't expecting trouble and facing someone who actually knows how to handle himself." The circle of students shifted restlessly, sensing that the talking was almost over and the real action was about to begin. Emma could see Sophie near the front of the crowd, her face pale with worry, and Bobby Martinez standing near the back, with an expression of hopeful terror, as if he couldn't decide whether to watch or run away. Jake began moving toward her with the fluid grace of an experienced athlete. His approach, neither rushed nor hesitant, but methodical and controlled. Emma recognized the strategy immediately. He was testing her reaction time and defensive instincts, while positioning himself for whatever opening her response might create. Sensei Williams always told me that the most dangerous opponents are the ones who think they already know everything about fighting, Emma said conversationally, adjusting her stance slightly to maintain optimal balance. They stop learning, stop adapting, stop growing. Your sensei sounds like a wise man, Jake replied, continuing his careful advance. Too bad he forgot to teach you when not to pick fights you can't win. Emma smiled, remembering countless sparring sessions where Sensei Williams had emphasized the importance of remaining calm and centered even when facing superior size and strength. Actually, that was one of his most important lessons. He taught me that you never really know if you can win a fight until you've already won it. Jake's approach brought him within striking distance, and Emma could see the subtle shift in his posture that indicated he was preparing to attack. His weight distribution changed almost imperceptibly, his right shoulder dropping slightly as he coiled his body for what would probably be a powerful straight punch aimed at overwhelming her defenses through pure force. The attack came faster than most of the watching students could follow, Jake's right hand shooting forward with the speed and power that had made him one of the most feared linebackers in the regional high school football league. It was exactly the kind of committed, devastating assault that had probably ended most of his previous confrontations before they really began. But Emma wasn't there when his fist arrived. She had moved the instant Jake's weight shifted, stepping off the line of attack with the fluid grace that came from thousands of hours of practicing kata forms. Jake's punch sailed past her shoulder, missing by inches, while Emma simultaneously grabbed his extended wrist with both hands and used his own momentum to pull him forward and off balance. What happened next unfolded with the kind of precise and timing that made advanced martial arts techniques appear almost magical to untrained observers. As Jake stumbled forward, overcommitted to his failed attack, Emma pivoted on her left foot and drove her right shoulder into his solar plexus while maintaining her grip on his wrist. The combination of leverage, timing, and redirected energy sent Jake flying through the air in a perfect shoulder throw that deposited him on the hard-packed earth with enough force to drive the wind from his lungs. The gathered students erupted in shocked exclamations and disbelieving laughter, their phones capturing every angle of Jake Thompson's spectacular flight and less than graceful landing. For a moment, the only sound was Jake's labored breathing as he tried to process what had just happened to him. Emma stepped back and waited, giving Jake space to recover while maintaining her ready stance. "Are we done here?" she asked calmly. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Jake rolled over and pushed himself to his feet, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and growing anger. The easy confidence he had displayed at the beginning of their confrontation was gone, replaced by the dangerous intensity of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged by circumstances he didn't understand. "Lucky shot," Jake growled, brushing dirt from his clothes, while the crowd continued to buzz with excitement. "Let's see you do that again." Emma sighed, recognizing that Jake was too invested in his own reputation to accept defeat gracefully. "Jake, this doesn't have to continue. You're a good athlete, probably a natural leader when you want to be. Why waste all that potential on bullying people who can't fight back?" "Because that's how the world works," Jake snapped, his composure finally cracking as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "There are winners and losers, predators and prey. I'd rather be a predator than spend my life being someone else's victim. He came at her again, this time with less technique but more fury, throwing a combination of punches designed to overwhelm her defenses through sheer aggression. Emma slipped the first punch with a simple head movement, deflected the second with her forearm, and caught the third in a classic wing chun trap that allowed her to control Jake's arm while delivering a precise palm strike to his chest. Jake staggered backward, more surprised than hurt, staring at Emma with something approaching genuine respect for the first time since their confrontation began. "What the hell are you?" "I'm someone who learned that real strength comes from protecting people, not hurting them," Emma replied, maintaining her defensive position while hoping that Jake might finally be ready to listen to reason. But Jake's pride was too deeply wounded to allow for rational conversation. With a roar of frustration, he charged forward like an angry bull, attempting to use his superior size and weight to simply overwhelm Emma's technical advantages through brute force. Emma sidestepped his charge with minimal effort, using a classic matador movement that sent Jake rushing past her toward the maintenance building wall. As he tried to stop his forward momentum and turn around, Emma demonstrated why. 8 years of intensive training created reflexes that couldn't be matched by pure athleticism. Moving with the fluid precision of a dancer, Emma stepped in behind Jake's turning movement and executed a technique that Sensei Williams had taught her during her brown belt training. Her right hand found the pressure point at the base of Jake's neck while her left hand controlled his shoulder, and a precisely applied squeeze temporarily disrupted the blood flow to his brain. Jake Thompson, the undisputed king of Riverside High School, crumpled to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut, unconscious, before he even realized what was happening to him. The crowd of students stood in stunned silence, struggling to process the fact that their school's most feared bully had just been rendered unconscious by a girl who barely reached his shoulder. Phone cameras continued recording, capturing the moment that would be replayed thousands of times on social media platforms and talked about for years to come. Emma knelt beside Jake's unconscious form, checking his pulse and breathing to make sure he wasn't seriously injured. The pressure point technique was designed to be temporary and harmless, causing unconsciousness through controlled blood flow restriction rather than trauma or damage. "He'll be fine," Emma announced to the worried crowd. "He should wake up in about 30 seconds. The technique just temporarily reduces blood flow to the brain. It doesn't cause any permanent damage." True to her prediction, Jake began stirring within half a minute, his eyes fluttering open with the confused expression of someone trying to figure out why they were lying on the ground, surrounded by staring faces. As consciousness fully returned, Emma could see the moment when he remembered what had happened, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been grudging admiration. Emma offered him her hand to help him to his feet, a gesture that surprised everyone present, including Jake himself. After a moment's hesitation, he accepted her assistance, allowing her to pull him upright while the crowd watched in fascination. "How did you do that?" Jake asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized their earlier exchanges. 8 years of training with one of the best martial arts instructors on the West Coast, Emma replied honestly. "My sensei taught me that the most advanced techniques aren't about hurting people. They're about ending conflicts with minimal harm to everyone involved." Jake rubbed the back of his neck where Emma had applied the pressure point technique, his expression thoughtful as he processed this new information. 8 years! Jesus! And you've been holding back this whole time? "I've been trying to avoid exactly this situation," Emma confirmed. "I came to Millbrook hoping to keep my head down and get through high school without any drama. But when I see people being hurt for no reason, I can't just stand by and pretend it's not happening." The crowd began to disperse as students realized that the confrontation was truly over. many of them already pulling out their phones to share videos and commentary about what they had just witnessed. Connor Walsh and Ryan Mitchell approached cautiously, both looking like they were reassessing everything they thought they knew about social hierarchies and power dynamics. "Jake," Connor said hesitantly, "what do we do now?" Jake looked around at the faces of his former followers, seeing uncertainty where there had once been automatic deference. Emma's decisive victory had shattered the illusion of his invincibility, and everyone present understood that the social order at Riverside High School had just undergone a fundamental shift. "Now we figure out how to be better," Jake said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine reflection that surprised everyone who heard it. "Maybe it's time to stop acting like being cruel makes us strong." Emma watched the interaction with cautious optimism, recognizing that real change would take time and consistent effort rather than a single dramatic moment. But Jake's words suggested that he might be genuinely ready to examine the beliefs and behaviors that had made him a source of fear rather than respect. Sophie pushed through the remaining crowd to reach Emma's side, her face a mixture of relief and amazement. "I can't believe you actually did it. I mean, I watched it happen and I still can't believe it." Emma smiled, feeling the tension that had been building for days finally beginning to dissipate. Sensei Williams always said that the best victories are the ones where everyone learns something valuable. I'm hoping this is one of those times. Bobby Martinez approached them shyly, his young face bright with something that might have been hope. "Does this mean things are going to be different now? I mean, are people like Jake going to stop picking on kids like me?" Emma looked over at Jake, who was having a quiet but intense conversation with Connor and Ryan. The three former bullies seemed to be genuinely processing the implications of what had just happened, discussing something with more seriousness than she had ever seen them display. "I think so," Emma said carefully. "But change takes time, and it requires everyone to participate. Jake and his friends have to decide they want to be better, and the rest of us have to give them the chance to prove they've changed." The walk back toward the main school building felt surreal, with Emma acutely aware of the way other students looked at her as she passed. Some faces showed admiration, others fear, and a few displayed the kind of calculating interest that suggested they were already planning how to benefit from the new social dynamic her victory had created. As they reached the parking lot, where Maria would be waiting to pick her up, Emma reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The confrontation with Jake had been inevitable from the moment she chose to intervene on Bobby Martinez's behalf, but the outcome had exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Instead of simply defeating a bully, she might have actually started a process of genuine change at Riverside High School. Maria was waiting in their Honda Civic, and her expression immediately shifted to concern as she noted the dirt on Emma's clothes and the excited energy of the students streaming out of the building behind her daughter. "How was your day, Mija?" Maria asked as Emma settled into the passenger seat, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer was going to be complicated. Emma buckled her seatbelt and considered her response carefully. "Better than I expected. I think Jake Thompson and I reached an understanding about how things are going to work from now on." Maria studied her daughter's face, noting the satisfied exhaustion that followed successful conflict resolution. After 16 years of motherhood, she had learned to recognize the signs that indicated Emma had been forced to use her martial arts training for its intended purpose. "Should I be worried about phone calls from the school administration?" Maria asked as they pulled out of the parking lot. "I don't think so. What happened today was off-school property, and I think everyone involved learned something important about respect and responsibility." Emma watched through the windshield as they passed the familiar landmarks of downtown Millbrook, seeing them with new eyes now that she felt truly settled in her new home. The drive home was peaceful, with both Emma and her mother lost in their own thoughts about the day's events and their implications for the future. Emma found herself thinking about Sensei Williams and wondering what he would have thought about her handling of the situation with Jake Thompson. She suspected he would have been proud of her restraint and her focus on ending the conflict rather than simply winning it. Their apartment felt more like home than it ever had before, filled with the comfortable quiet of a family that had successfully navigated a major challenge together. As Emma settled at the dining table to work on her homework, she realized that, for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she felt genuinely optimistic about her future at Riverside High School. The next morning brought a dramatically different atmosphere to the school hallways. Students who had previously avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully as Emma passed, while others approached her directly to express their gratitude for standing up to the bullying that had made their lives miserable. Jake Thompson was already at his locker when Emma arrived, and she was surprised to see that he looked genuinely different somehow. The arrogant swagger that had characterized his movement through the school was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful and self-aware. "Hey, Portland," Jake said as she approached her own locker. "Got a minute to talk?" Emma nodded, curious about what Jake might want to discuss in the clear light of day, away from the drama and adrenaline of their previous confrontation. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Jake continued, his voice lacking the commanding tone that had once made other students automatically defer to his wishes. "About using strength to protect people instead of hurting them. I think maybe I've been doing this whole leadership thing wrong." Emma studied his expression, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only what appeared to be genuine reflection. "What are you thinking about doing differently?" Jake glanced around the hallway, noting the way other students were watching their conversation with intense interest. "I'm thinking about talking to Principal Davidson about starting some kind of peer mediation program. Maybe if people have a way to resolve conflicts without violence, there won't be as much bullying and intimidation." The suggestion surprised Emma, who had expected Jake to need more time to process the lessons of their confrontation. "That's actually a really good idea. I'd be willing to help if you think it would be useful." "I was hoping you'd say that," Jake replied with the first genuine smile Emma had ever seen from him. "I figure someone with your training and philosophy might have some valuable insights about conflict resolution." As the morning bell rang and students began moving toward their first period classes, Emma found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn her life had taken since arriving in Millbrook. What had started as an attempt to maintain a low profile and avoid complications had evolved into something much more meaningful. An opportunity to use her skills and training to create positive change in her new community. Mrs. Anderson's English class that morning featured a discussion of heroism in literature, with several students drawing connections between fictional characters and real-world examples of moral courage. Emma noticed that many of her classmates kept glancing in her direction during the discussion, clearly thinking about the previous day's events, but too polite to make direct references. "Heroism isn't about being fearless," Mrs. Anderson said, as the period drew to a close. "It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid, even when the cost might be high. True heroes are people who use their abilities to protect others rather than advance their own interests." After class, Mrs. Anderson approached Emma's desk with a knowing smile. "I heard there was some excitement yesterday afternoon. I hope everything worked out for the best." Emma gathered her books, appreciating the teacher's diplomatic way of acknowledging the situation without prying for details. "I think it did. Sometimes people just need to be reminded that there are consequences for hurting others." "Indeed," Mrs. Anderson agreed, "and sometimes they need to be shown that there are better ways to be strong than making other people weak." The rest of the school day passed with a surreal sense of normalcy, as if the dramatic confrontation behind the maintenance building had somehow reset the social dynamics of Riverside High School. Students who had previously seemed locked into rigid hierarchies of dominance and submission were suddenly interacting with more respect and consideration for each other. During lunch, Emma was surprised to see Jake Thompson sitting with Bobby Martinez at a table near the windows. The two of them engaged in what appeared to be a serious but friendly conversation. Connor Walsh and Ryan Mitchell sat nearby, both looking slightly uncomfortable but making an obvious effort to include Bobby in their discussion. "Now that's something I never thought I'd see," Sophie observed as she and Emma settled at their usual table. Jake Thompson voluntarily talking to someone he used to torment and actually listening to what they have to say. Emma watched the interaction with cautious optimism, recognizing that real change was a process rather than an event. People can surprise you when they're given the chance to be better than they thought they could be. The weeks that followed brought gradual but noticeable improvements to the social climate at Riverside High School. The peer mediation program that Jake had proposed was approved by Principal Davidson and began operating with Emma and Jake, serving as the primary mediators for student conflicts. The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations, with even serious disputes being resolved through discussion and compromise rather than intimidation and violence. Jake Thompson's transformation from bully to advocate became one of the most talked about developments in the school's recent history. Students who had once feared his attention now sought his help with problems ranging from academic struggles to family difficulties. His natural leadership abilities, channeled toward positive purposes, made him genuinely popular rather than merely feared. Emma found herself settling into Riverside High School's social fabric in ways she had never expected when she first arrived in Millbrook. Her reputation as someone who could defend herself and others when necessary created a sense of security that allowed other students to feel safer and more confident in their daily interactions. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. There were still incidents of bullying and intimidation, still students who struggled to find their place in the school's social hierarchy. But the overall atmosphere had shifted in fundamental ways, with kindness and respect becoming more valued than cruelty and dominance. On a Friday afternoon in late November, as the first snow of the season began falling outside the classroom windows, Emma reflected on everything that had changed. Since her arrival in Millbrook, what had started as an unwanted disruption to her carefully planned new life had evolved into something much more meaningful. An opportunity to use her training and principles to create lasting positive change in her community. Sensei Williams had always taught her that martial arts was ultimately about service to others, about using strength and skill to make the world a safer and more just place. For the first time since beginning her training 8 years earlier, Emma felt like she truly understood what her sensei had meant. As she gathered her books and prepared to head home, Emma smiled at the sight of Jake Thompson helping a freshman student who had dropped his textbooks in the hallway. The scene would have been unimaginable just months earlier, but it had become routine in the new social environment that their confrontation had helped create. Sometimes, Emma realized, the best fights really were the ones that ended with everyone becoming stronger and better than they had been before. And sometimes the greatest victories were measured not in defeats inflicted, but in lives improved and communities transformed. Walking toward the parking lot, where her mother waited with their familiar Honda Civic, Emma felt genuinely grateful for the chain of events that had brought her family to Millbrook. What had seemed like just another new beginning had turned into something much more significant, a chance to discover that strength used wisely could create exactly the kind of world worth fighting for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you Won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.